So we're going into our Resiliency Innovations Panel Discussion now, which is going to be moderated by David Rathke, who will introduce our industry leader panelists. David is the Executive Director of Resiliency Florida, who works to help Florida communities plan and adapt for extreme weather and sea level rise. He is also the owner of Rathke Enterprises, a consulting firm specializing in governmental affairs, public relations, business process improvement, human resource best practices, and strategic planning. He has worked with various aspects of environmental and public policy, media relations, strategic planning, and finance throughout his career, and is a graduate of University of Central Florida. David, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. What she didn't mention is I grew up in Southwest Florida, so just a little bit north of here. So I may know some of you from days gone by. To my panel, I'm going to quote former Senate President Jim King. There's nothing standing between them and adult beverages except for us. So we got to hit cleanup. So resilience, it's a community affair. We've heard from a lot of great scientists so far today, but we're going to go in a little bit different direction now for the remainder of our time and talk about how to ensure that every aspect of our community can respond to these storms, to disasters, and the like. So we've got folks here from private sector companies who are going to give it a little bit different perspective, whether it is from an engineering approach, which Catherine and Mike will talk about, or from a business continuity and safety approach, which John will cover. So I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, John Patrone, Catherine Prince, and Michael Flood. John Patrone of Patrone Risk provides legal risk management and security programming services. He is a current member of the SMA Emergency Preparedness Committee and has served as a member of the Syracuse University College of Law Board. Mr. Patrone is a graduate of Manhattan College and attended Syracuse University College of Law, where he attained his Juris Doctorate. Catherine Prince leads the Florida Resilience and Sustainability Practice for WSP, a consulting firm, and she also has done a lot of prior work with local governments, primarily in Miami and Fort Lauderdale, prior to joining WSP. Michael Flood is the National Resiliency Lead, also with WSP, and in his role, Mike has led many national projects focused on determining the risks of extreme weather and climate change and developing potential strategies to address those risks. We're going to do a little something different today with this. We want this to be an interactive panel. So as we go, not only am I going to ask questions to our panelists, but we're going to ask questions through Menti of all of you so that we can get your input on several hot topics. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with our first question and kind of prime the pump. So this one is to John, or John and Mike, actually. As industry leaders with experience in community resilience and recovery, what do you believe is the single most important takeaway for communities to be better prepared for future disasters like Hurricane Ian?
First of all, thank you for having me here today, and the things that you folks are doing with the Southwest Florida Climate Summit are excellent, are needed, and thanks. It's interesting for me to sit here kind of on the different end, working with security and safety and the building of emergency preparedness plans with major facilities throughout the country, working with the major sporting stadiums in Florida from Miami to Tampa to Jacksonville, working with an entity like the Florida State Fair, diverse group of facilities that are all used or all affected by, obviously, a storm, just as community members are throughout the community when a storm does hit. It was interesting to listen to Dr. Savarese earlier and him mentioning the storms all having a different character. Listening to Sarah with regard to the assessments that are done with regard to historical buildings. And then after the assessments, the go back and view to see what happened or didn't happen. The bottom line is the different characters and what happened or didn't happen are what we learn from. What you folks have learned from with the storms from Irma on and before. What we learned from the storms, not only in Florida, the changing of the rain here, tornadoes in different times of the year, but the happenings throughout the country. And one of the biggest things I see for community resilience and recovery and things that should be looked at are after-action reports. After-action reports with regard to the storms that affect the communities here, and also looking out to after-action reports from other areas, because those other areas may have a different character, but those areas are affected in ways you have been affected or may be affected. And that is the only way that we're able to then go back and formulate a new plan. Emergency planning, business continuity planning is not a one and done. It's an evolution. Planning is an evolution. We seek consistency and continuity that, by the way, can go out the door tomorrow, the next day, or an hour from now. But it's going back and reviewing and working and evolving that is important. It's taking what you learn and putting it to play with your organizations, with your facilities, with your municipalities, and having all layers involved in some manner or fashion. With regard to training, with regard to exercising, the use of tabletops, whether the use of tabletop exercises be done on a large scale with inside and outside stakeholders, or, as important, a smaller scale, a smaller storm that has some flooding where you involve everybody from A to Z in your organization so that those folks get an idea of what planning is. And they're not afraid to speak up at the larger training or the larger exercise, and you begin to have them involved. The other thing is, I've read it throughout the ARs I've looked at, is time delineated scheduling. When you know where and how things are going to occur and we get that 2 or 3 week lead on what could happen, having in place, okay, these things are going to be done, or we're going to attempt to do things at these times to put these things in place. The other thing is with regard to planning, and it's nice to have a big book, and some of the books that we've worked with regard to facilities or organizations are about 10 times the size of this piece of paper, and everybody has to go through them and you change them. The use of technology. We use technology for so many things. Technology should be used by your municipalities, your organizations for emergency planning, because that technology can put into effect items that have to be completed, the knowledge that they are completed because there's communication from the individual who has to do it to the command center, the incident command that is preparing and in place with regard to the storms upcoming or the issues that may be upcoming. So there are many things you can do to get folks involved, but they have to be done beforehand. They're ever changing. They have to be changed, and the time has to be put in to do these things, which, by the way, organizations don't always have that time. Not to shoot a boost for Patron or anyone, but if you need a consultant, dollars are spent, and dollars should be spent on that basis to make sure your I's are dotted, your T's are crossed. It's too important not to. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Flood, and I wanted to stand up here. I have a Irish Catholic mother, and she's always said to me that I did a whole lot of work to bring you out into this universe, so you better stand up straight as a result. So I've taken that to heart ever since then, and feel like I need to honor her, or at least live under that Irish Catholic whatever curtain that we'll call that, okay? So one of the things I wanted to talk about, that I think is important context. So we're going to talk a lot about context and decision-making here in the next hour, and I wanted to just give you a few points of context for kind of understanding the state of the resilience practice and how decisions potentially can be made. And the first thing I want to point out is I work for an engineering firm, but I'm not an engineer, right? So I've been doing work in resilience for a very long time now, over a decade, and in my interactions with the engineers who have basically built your communities and every other community around the country, there's 2 points that I think everybody should understand. One of which is the designs that are made are built on design criteria, right? So you hear a lot about a 50-year event or a 100-year event. A designer basically takes that value and designs your infrastructure in your communities. What they don't do, and they do that based on observations of past conditions. That's the way every bit of design is done in that way. And I want to tell you that the thing they don't do across the board, there's no consideration of what happens if that gets exceeded, right? So there's no like, I design it to a 50-year condition. What happens if hey Jane, you designed that to a 50-year condition. What happens if a 100-year event comes in? I don't know, Mike. That's not my job, right? That's not really what I do. So that's an important bit of context when you're thinking about resilience, how decisions are made, and how the designs have occurred. And I say that because when we do work in places like Florida or Texas or other places where the term future conditions might be a little complicated, I think you need to start with the basis that there's existing risks, right? That's the critical part, is there's actually existing risks that are everywhere because of those decisions that have been made over time. There's existing risks everywhere in your community based on that concern. So that's one thing that's important to understand. The other thing to understand, and we're going to go through it in a little bit more detail, is even the current practices for making decisions around resilience aren't really that great in fully defining the consequences at the level of detail, at the community scale. Like, you know, you heard a lot earlier about flood modeling, quantificate some risk material. It's all a mathematical model that doesn't get down to what's happening to my church, what's happening to my economic center, what's happening to my environment by these changes, by these conditions, and how do I start to use that information or define that information to a better level of context. So if I was a community leader or a community member, I would start to define what those changes are going to happen in my community. That's critical information that you need to support decisions, to support requests for better investments, and then to identify ways to make a different decision. Say, what are the consequences? If we see a storm, what's the environmental damage that's going to occur? How's that going to affect our community assets? We want to make sure that that conversation gets elevated back into the decision making. So I think those are the two critical factors. Understand that resilience is not a future consideration, it's a today consideration. It's potentially worsening into the future. And then also that the fuller comprehensive definition of consequences is a critical part of effective decisions.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks, John. Appreciate that answer. So, as I mentioned a second ago, we're all in it together. And this is going to, we're going to try and do something a little different. So there's an old business adage that goes something along the lines of, all of us are smarter than one of us, or something like that. There's about 100 of you out there, and there's only 4 of us up here. So we have a question for you now. So get ready with your mentee, because here's your question. Now, in a word or two, what do you see as the most important element to building community resilience in our region? We've got a lot of good ones coming in. Any of our panelists care to comment on these? I see one that I would like to comment on, which is education, because I'm a former teacher. So, and in PR, we talk about the need to educate the public a lot, but it can't just stop there. You can't tell somebody, here's a bunch of information. From a public relations perspective, it's also got to be about changing their behavior. What do you want people to do with the information you give them? So that's my comment on that. But it's a great word, and you have to start somewhere, and education is a great place to start.
I would add communication, obviously, for what I do and the things that the firm does and the security or safety issues out there, weather or other. It's communication. It's communication between not only the organization or the facility and maybe the municipality that they are at, but also with, and I'll speak about it in a little while, also with their community neighbors. Everybody's in it together, and it's that collaboration, that collaboration between those groups that can aid in the growth and preparedness for the eventual issue that could occur.
And I guess my head count was pretty close. We got 99 responses. So thank you all very much. Okay, next question. John, from your private industry perspective, what is an innovative way you have seen or that you can suggest as to how a local community has or could better prepare itself operationally for a disaster?
And that starts with a base, that local community, the entities within that local community, each having their own security plan, so to speak, sitting down and saying, okay, as my business is going to be affected or could be affected, putting on paper, these could be the issues, bringing folks in from the organization to sit with you as a team, because that's what we are. And if it's not team in, we're team out when something happens. So it's building beforehand as that team. Then taking it a step further, as I just spoke a minute ago, taking your community neighbors. They're going to have a lot of the same issues. They may have a camera system that can be helpful to you in the event of something occurring. They may be tied into a command center and you're not. And getting together with those community folks and actually meeting and sitting down and having discussions. And then tying each of those in with your governmental entity, because they do a great job and they work hard, but if they don't know your individual issues, problem comes, that problem can't be fixed. The other end of it is, when you work with your community neighbors, they may have a knowledge of, hey, we've got contracts with these vendors. Have you thought of these vendors? Maybe you're thinking of other vendors. They may have places or areas where you can go eventually for secondary operations that you don't have. Maybe you're not big enough or you don't have the dollars to do that within the community. The other thing that I think is very important is, I'll go back to the team, the employees. A lot of us don't know what our employees' past backgrounds are. A lot of us don't know or don't always sit down with our employees. If this problem were to occur, how can we be helpful to each other? The operation of the business may change for a period of time, but how can you train beforehand to use your employees who obviously need employment after the issue, and you have to help get yourself running? What better people to use? What better people to be involved in your rebuild if you have to rebuild? So it's knowing these things and putting these things together. And then the other end of it is, if you've got plans, and I mentioned it earlier, putting those plans together and exercising and training on those plans and making sure that your documentation is updated. And by the way, one of the most important things is the individuals we put in our emergency operation plans or our standard operating procedures. People from the municipal level can come and go. People from your business level can come and go. Emails can come and go. Phone numbers can come and go. The first time that we're changing that, we don't want to be at catastrophe one. Those things have to be done before. And they're not going to be an end-all and a cure, but they're going to help you get on the road to where you have to be.
Okay, to the 99, we have two questions now. First question. Ranking from 1 as totally inadequate to 5 as totally adequate, how would you rate your community's current preparedness? Looks like the most of you picked somewhere in the middle. So, especially since y'all have been through this not long ago, I would think that you had a pretty good perspective on that. Next question. If your community's preparedness is not already totally adequate, describe in a word or two what needs to be improved.
It's good to see such a controversial topic like managed retreat always popping up in the dialogue. It's definitely a challenging one for sure. That requires a lot of very effective communication to pull that one off, that's for sure.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I see the crowd has grown. They must have heard good things were happening in this room. So, Catherine and Mike, there is more resiliency and emergency response needs, such as upgrading wastewater and stormwater systems, rebuilding government facilities, and other tasks to be able to withstand more extreme weather events. Then there is funding available, which we just saw some of those popping up on the last Menti question. How do you, from a business perspective, suggest risks can be prioritized and projects be implemented to ensure the highest and most pressing needs are addressed first?
I'm gonna take the first stab at this one, and then Catherine's gonna go next. And for years, when I make presentations, I try and show the wrong way of doing things and then show the right way of doing things second. And I found out that was a very ineffective way of supporting decisions, because people just paid attention for the first half and then, I don't know, took a nap in the second half. So what I thought I'd do is I'm going to focus on how to address this question, but I'm actually going to split it into two parts, because I'm going to say, all right, how do you identify potential ways to support effective prioritization, but also, which is basically to consider how to spend existing funds, but then also how do you potentially wrap up making a case to potentially make the case for additional funds once you recognize that there's a pressing need. How do you make that case for the pressing need? So it's kind of, those two policy questions are kind of linked together, obviously, and the big thing with risk and resilience and climate change resilience is all the uncertainty. You can see it popping up in the questions, right? Education, education, information, information. We need better information and education to have a better understanding of it. And that basically goes back to what I said at first, is the way that decisions have been made. And just the entrenched idea of that's the way that investments are going to be made is based on past conditions and the identification of design criteria. So no discussion at all of risk and consequences. So this first slide basically says that really you need to think about, and there's, to really geek out even in the current decision making, there's a lot of uncertainty in the frameworks that are applied to make investment decisions currently. Often very much unrecognized, and then you have the consideration of climate change in the first. So there's many, many thousands of examples of terrible ideas out there, let's just put it that way, for how to talk about this and how to make better and more investment decisions. So the thing you need to think about, and it took me about, 100 nights spread over 5 years of red wine, which always makes me think better, about trying to really think this thing through, right? And the thing, if you think about it, like, what's the logic flow? Like, how do we talk about these concerns in a way that sets a logic that can be supportive of decision making, but also can be communicated to the public, which I think is the key. How do you describe this stuff in a way that everybody can understand, which is really the problem with the way not to do it, which I'll get to a little bit later in the presentation. All right, so what would be the first thing you would do? So what do you want to do? You're basically trying to understand what potentially is going to happen, right? So we want to consider climate change, right? So you heard Peter, you heard the NOAA folks, you heard all those people talking about all these great models, all this great data that's being generated. What does that turn into? Well, you can actually grab that data and pull it into your analysis. You can say, okay, well, if things are changing, I'm going to pull that into my traditional flood modeling. I can plug in the new values. It gives me new information on flooding. It looks over the landscape, and we can define that. We can define sea level rise. We can define storm surge with Peter's models. We can look at things that are very beneficial, so we can, okay, so now we understand what's happening with climate change. I'm just kind of skipping some slides here, I think. Anyway, so I'll just go in whatever random order my slides come out. This should be a very interesting conversation. You guys follow the logic, okay? So, the next part basically is you have to turn that into an understanding, and this is one of the key parts that everybody talks about is this thing called return period flooding, or likely flooding and unlikely flooding. So you have to establish those bounds in an understanding of flooding. What does the flooding look like over the landscape? What does it look like at my assets? And then there's this question of exceedances. Like what happens if and when would that condition occur, so that I can understand what's happening to my community, my church, my bridge. So that's obviously a critical part. Okay, and then, so then you have this technical capacity of somebody to tell you what climate change is that exists, and there's plenty of people out there that can tell you what that is. There's plenty of people, professionals, that can tell you how that affects your flooding. You heard of some of them this morning, right? They can tell you how that changes your flooding. And then there's people that can tell you what that flooding does to your asset. How does it damage it? Like what's happening to my community asset? So that's the next part of the logic. Okay, so I can put all this together. I can understand what's happening to my church. What's happening to my HVAC system? What's happening to my electrical system? There's people that can give you all this information about the actual physical effect on your asset. So we can put that part of the logic together. And then we can start to think about how that has a system or community effect. So, and this is actually the Alps in Southwest Florida. Sorry about the drawing here, but it kind of gets to the point of what it's intended to do. But really, we can start to say, okay, if I lose this community center, the community doesn't get their public health benefits as long as that period is out of service. So there's ways to start to define this very specifically by talking to another set of professionals or the community or the asset owners, which kind of gets the additional logic. And then you can actually assign a dollar value to all this. You can say that there's repair costs, there's repair time, there's loss of service, that all comes with a cost. And we can assign those values and generate this type of information, which obviously, and what this is this is actually called the present value of risk. I'm not going to get into too much information about what that is, but it just basically wraps it up and says, what's our present value of risk today? And you can see this is a very clear representation of what should be done first, right? We have assets that are very high risk in terms of present value at risk score. What this also gives you, this is actually what I would say the best argument to address one of the comments we saw from the Q&A, which is basically get rid of all the Republicans, right? Somebody wrote on there, like, what's our best way of getting to resilience? Get rid of all the Republicans. And I think that comes from the lack of communication. It really does. Like, if we all knew that this is what the types of impacts and costs that the communities are facing, then the decisions come easier, obviously, right? If you can put this logic together, then this is a great way of affecting very good outcomes. It's a very clear presentation of information that we think everybody can understand. Everybody can kind of come around and determine it. We can look at existing risks and how those things change over time. It's a very powerful and effective way of talking about that. The one thing you'll notice is we didn't really talk to anybody, right? This is like a bunch of nerdy analysts, and like I have a team of a bunch of PhDs that sit around and just dream up these models all the time, and I call them the heartless analysts, right? They just sit there and they drive all this information out, and they find this information, but really it doesn't get any benefit of actually understanding what these impacts are at the community scale, and we're going to have Catherine kind of talk that through for you.
Good afternoon. That was for Mike. So when we talk about risk-based assessments and decision-making, there are a couple of other data points that we need to collect aside from the modeling. Things like how do we account for ecosystem benefits? How do we account for livability benefits? We know that people, when they gather in social spaces, those become valuable to the community. We talked about the church in Macedonia, the Macedonia Church in Naples. How do we account for culturally significant spaces? And lastly, and very importantly, how do we quantify benefits in terms of social equity? We know we have frontline communities that are disproportionately impacted. How do we account for that? So when we look at impacts of assets, we should also consider the consequences of those impacts to the communities that they are in. And with these additional data points, we get the holistic picture, and we may conclude that some of the most cost-effective investments might not be the most or the best ways to address the community's immediate needs. So a small roadway or a church may come up higher on the prioritization list than a simple modeling exercise might render. So once we prioritize, the next question is, how do we design, how do we adapt, and how do we get the funding for construction and for maintenance, which we will talk about in the next question. So back to you, David.
Okay, so audience question. Please prioritize the following infrastructure challenges from the most pressing to the least. Ranking and upgrading wastewater plants, replacing septics with sewer, increasing flood water and storage water, for examples, elevating roads and bridges, updating codes to increase building standards, etc. Yeah, pretty even on some of those, but it looks like stormwater storage and floodwater retention was the largest. Yeah, they're all definitely important. Okay. So, Catherine, with your experience working on climate vulnerability assessments and emergency response planning, what is the most effective way you believe that we can ensure equity across all socioeconomic groups in our resiliency and emergency response efforts?
All right, thank you, David. Yes. So before we begin answering that question, I wanted to talk about resiliency. Like, what does it mean? Like, what is the definition? One, it's the ability to withstand stressors, and two, it's the ability to bounce back. So when we think of community resilience, to me, it is about the people. How do they get to work? How do they go to their places of worship and schools? So how does a community bounce back after the stressor? And to unpack this, first we need to understand who is impacted and how they are impacted. So risk-based assessments, like what Mike introduced, it considers both the impact to the assets itself as well as the consequences of those impacts on people. So for example, let's talk about a person, let's say her name is Martha. She works an hourly job at a restaurant across a barrier island. She lives in the mainland, and she has a 45-minute commute. There is a stressor event 2 days after it passes and the water in her neighborhood recedes. She needs to get back to work. Unfortunately, the bridge that connects the mainland and the barrier island is damaged from the stressor event, and the detour she needs to take is about a mile. So it adds in about an hour to her commute. And it just so happens that Martha is not the only person who's doing that commute. Majority of the people in her community are also making that commute. So think about the burden that Martha and her community faces, which is additional cost as far as travel time, as well as the fuel cost. Now, if Martha has a child or an aging parent, perhaps she's not able to make it to her job. So it's an immense burden on the family itself, but it's a ripple effect on the community and the local economy. So this is the additional set of data we need to discuss along with the asset impacts. The one bridge that connects the community to the services, to the workers may be very critical for the community to bounce back after a stressor. And how do we understand what these consequences are? It really is talking to people, listening, and Sarah Kirby talked about this in her discussion. It's going to communities with an open mind without having any assumptions, right? We never want to assume we understand where people come from. Every experience is unique. Once we listen, then we educate and ask follow-up questions. And when we educate, it's very important to communicate and message technical information in a way that resonates and that they can respond with the information we need to then make our decisions on how we adapt. So for example, using words like 10-year event or 100-year event doesn't mean much unless you're talking to a group of scientists or kids who are doing probability classes, right? So how do we translate that to the community? So if we say, let's say 25-year event and we want to get feedback from the community, we talk about how it impacts their lives. So how does this impact Martha, her family, her community, and how does it affect her ability to get to her place of work? So a 25-year storm, a likelihood and probability of occurring is probably low, but when it does occur, your home may sustain some flooding damage, and you may not be able to leave your house for a couple of days. Let's say there's going to be 1 feet of water stagnant for a day before the water recedes. During that time, you will not be able to use your sedan to get out. At the same time, emergency vehicles, at least the tall ones, are the only ones who can get to you if there's an emergency. So connecting a event, which is a 25-year storm event, to how it impacts people in their daily lives is an important way of communicating. And once we get to that level of communication, we get feedback and data from the community, which then aids our decision-making process. So, all right, once we get, I got this. So once we get a better understanding of the entire picture and we have all the data points, then we discuss how do we adapt and design for the level of risk that we want to address. And what is the level of investment that is needed for the infrastructure to adapt, and what is the acceptable residual risk? Because any investment will have a residual risk to the community. So we want to make sure we are transparent from the get-go and we communicate effectively through the entire process. So we talk about how do we adapt. There is an entire process very similar to the risk-based assessment that Mike mentioned for area-wide, where we can do a net present value of risk for alternates, which again puts apples to apples comparison for alternates and help better decision making. Once we identify the preferred alternate design, then we go into funding. How do we fund these investments? And here's an example of a benefit clause analysis. Very often we find that there are very specific requirements for how assets are impacted and the cost of damage to the assets. And sometimes there is missing guidance on how to account for the intangibles. The Macedonia church is a good example. How significant it is culturally cannot be captured or quantified in the existing templates. This is an example in Protect Grant that we did. So when we did the calculations, we quantified some examples or some aspects which could be, and we also made sure to do the backup in terms of intangibles that we couldn't quantify because of the template provided. Can we quantify? The answer is yes. Here's an example there's a benefit cost analysis that was done for the HUD CDBG grant, that was the previous slide, we were able to quantify, we developed our own template, we were able to quantify net present value during the project's service life for resilience, for social benefits, for environmental benefits, as well as economic cost to the entire community. And when we think about consequences, it's also long-term consequences. There was a discussion on, or a couple of folks mentioned managed retreat. It is a topic that not always discussed. So I want to wrap up with this thought. In here is adaptation and equity. In this example, the red line highlighted is a corridor project, which is a much higher elevation than the waterfront communities, about 10, 15 feet. So what happens when the communities which are in the waterfront are no longer livable because of frequent loss or because of uninsurability? We know, or we can anticipate that the communities that live in the waterfront will potentially move inland. So displacing people who have lived there historically. So now, this is not a new concept. We have already seen this. For example, in Miami, it's already happening in Little Haiti and other spaces. So in this example, we were able to identify that there were some sections or communities which are more susceptible than others for displacement. So when we think about adaptation, considering the long-term impacts along with the consequences, the short-term consequences as well as the long-term consequences of decision-making is important. And with that, back to you, David.
Okay. A question now for the audience. Okay, so audience, what equity concerns or challenges have arisen in your community's emergency response efforts? This is an open-ended Menti question. So any of our panelists want to comment on any of these? Refrigeration, that's interesting. I can think of, after Ian, there was a problem that FWC ran into down in Fort Myers with the shrimp fleet. And they didn't have any refrigeration at the fish houses because all of the ice machines were basically down, no electricity, et cetera. So not only were the boats impacted and couldn't go out to fish, but even if they could, there was no place to store them.
I look at the spread of resources. And you folks had the issues here. You had issues on the water, and then you had issues inland. And the expectation, maybe some of the other issues inland, and the treatment of the same, both on the water and inland, becomes an important issue to be looked at and re-looked at based upon after-action reporting and after-action testing to see how that can be improved.
I see another interesting one. Lack of non-English services. Emergency alerts only sent in English. We're in Florida. That's very dangerous in my mind. So we need to, it goes back to communications, and especially the further south in Florida you go, the fewer and fewer native English-speaking people we have. So in Miami-Dade, for example, you have communities where people may not speak any English at all. And during the pandemic, we also had issues. I worked at the Department of Management Services at that time, and people were trying to apply for unemployment benefits, for reemployment. And they couldn't because the applications, one, were on paper, and two, they were in English. So we had to come out with, more paperwork, and then we needed people to translate, not only for Spanish, but Creole and other languages. Next question is for John. So, John, many communities currently do not have a natural resource element in their emergency response plans to address pressing public health issues that arise in natural disasters. What do you see, with your experience in risk management, as the best way for local governments to go about developing and incorporating these elements into their respective local emergency response plans?
You know, when you talk about the possible pollution, spread of debris, water and inland issues, water sampling, it's interesting. I think these items are beginning to come to the forefront based upon the issues that we've had over the last 5 years anyways, whether it be back in New Orleans, which is even longer, some issues in Texas and Florida. We are seeing, and we've done some tabletop exercises at some colleges, at some major entertainment facilities, outdoor, with regard to having the experts involved in the planning at that stage, so that obviously if this occurred, what would be done? What would be done on the municipal level? Who would those individuals have to contact? How would they follow up? I don't think it's where it has to be yet, and probably everybody here would agree, but I think it's come to the forefront. And, you know, I read what came back on as to some of the questions earlier, and guess what? We learn something new every day. And some things that weren't as bad get worse, and we have to deal with them. And it's that preparation, communication, coordination. You need them all. And then you've got to get together, and through that, you exercise and you train and you get better. There's no solid answer. It's a step at a time. It's like a baby crawling. We want to run right away. Sadly, we can't. But I do see these things being approached. We have been involved in the exercising. So I think it's something that will become obviously even stronger because it has to.
Okay, audience, how important do you feel it is to add a natural resource element to your community's emergency response plan? What we're talking about there is making sure that the right equipment is on hand so that first responders can get through debris-strewn, toxic water, you know, that kind of thing. Okay, it looks like folks think it's very important. So I do too. All right, this is our last prepared question for our panelists, and this one is going to go to Mike. But all of you start preparing your general questions for any of us, and we're going to do that after Mike answers this final question. So audience, please feel free to start entering those questions. So Mike, how do you see private industry being able to support and partner with government on adaptive planning to consider future conditions and develop better strategies and policies so communities are future ready?
Everybody loves Catherine, but she steals the little thing. See that? See what happened? Hey, I wanted to let you know, we actually, my second favorite coworker besides Catherine actually just left our group and went to FEMA, and they have a new program that's kind of rolling out in March about the recovery. I don't know if you see that they're really trying to streamline things and make resources available much earlier. So I think they're trying at least, and I know Lauren's going to do the big thing. So hopefully they can resolve that. We're kind of working on things on our own. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the private sector in general. But the first thing I want to do is go back to what not to do, like I promised at the beginning. I do want to spend a little bit of time about what not to do because there's some great examples out there. As a matter of fact, most of the examples in the field are exactly what not to do. And I actually call, people say, what are the biggest disasters in the resilience perspective? I say, well, the way we're doing our work actually is the two biggest disasters of resilience. And they kind of arose from the original policy framework. So there was people from the beginning didn't really know what to do, so they developed this terminology. They developed this thing called indicators, right, which is actually termed proxy indicator, to tell you a little bit about what it means. And this framework has dominated resilience. It's basically, and the best way to think about it is, how do I think about risks? I have an asset that's old, I have something that's old, I have something that somebody uses a lot, therefore we need to invest in it. It's basically that simple. but it really misses the point of what's happening to that and how to support that decision. So if you see the terms exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity, run away. If you see proxy indicators, run away. And but if you sit down and just research tonight resilience assessments, that's what you're going to see. You're going to see that most of all because that's the way it's kind of been done from the beginning. And I'd say largely that was a process of there was nothing to base your decision on, so people just came up with the framework. But you heard throughout the panels today that there's so much more information and beneficial information defining the future conditions that you can actually make better, more science-based decisions now. And I say that because if you work in government, if you live in Florida, I want to let you know that the private sector is thinking about these things as much as you are. They are investing in understanding the risks to their assets. They're investing in understanding the risks to their investments. They're looking at how they do the business, how things get done. And I know that's because we have another group that does all private sector work. They're basically working with many of the large corporations that are present in Florida are thinking about these things themselves. So they're engaged in this question. Now, the interesting thing when you sit down and talk to them is they've been kind of working through their assessments and they go, well, at some point we need to engage the communities, right? Because we should be in partnership with the communities to understand and define our risks because they're actually willing and interested in making an investment to protect their area or their neighborhood. They're actually putting funding out to help support these things. But I haven't heard yet of a place where they've actually connected with the communities and say, hey, let's think this out together. But it's right there. It's coming very soon to have a kind of a collaborative framework of business interests and government interests kind of focus on the same thing, which again would likely remove some of the political dynamic of the whole thing because everybody's kind of focused in on the same question. So I just wanted to make that point. So, and you can see basically the way these things came together. The one on the left is the one I'm telling you to never do because you can see it's very difficult to say, well, I have this asset and it's an 81, and that's really why we want to focus on it. We want to focus on this because it's scored at 81, and you'll see this everywhere. There's like most of the jurisdictions in Florida are doing it on the left side. Major jurisdictions in Florida doing it on the left side. State guidance, left side. It's all basically this framework for decision making, but most of the private sector folks have already switched over to the right side because it gives you critical information. Obviously, it gives you repair costs, outage periods costs, like we laid out at the beginning. So this is kind of a private sector driven assessment because they're saying we have these investments out there. So so then the next part is to make sure that those strategies kind of align with the goals. So there's ways to think about an adaptation action plan that has this level of integration and effectiveness, and then also to help make that case for determination. So there's ways to identify these strategies and identify the data requirements. And here I wanted to just highlight, like I talked earlier about the design flow. This part's also changing on the left, or on this slide, which is basically, and all this says is basically is I'm an engineer, I need to stop paying attention to what I'm designing to and start to pay attention to when it's worse than that condition. I need to start incorporating that into my assessments and my decision making. So again, another private sector function that's kind of coming online. And then it all kind of wraps up with this question of, and the one thing is there's, in my history in this business, in life basically, there's never been as many resources available to assessing resilience in history. There's just so much resources out there, and there's federal resources, as many of you heard, there's more resources kind of coming online. The state of Florida, the state government in Florida has put amazing resources down at the community level, which is basically raising awareness, raising an understanding of the concerns, and really driving, like we talked about, the education and the communication so that everybody in the community is more informed and can advocate for better decisions moving forward. So all these things are basically driving a better understanding, but I will say that at least all these resources, you need to make the case to them that you're a beneficial investment. You know, why would we invest in you? There's, like we talked about, there's needs all over the country. Why would we invest in your community over other communities? And there, we talked about that resilience-based assessment, but also potentially the opportunity to partner with some of the private sector organizations to pull this off. Now, we'll say the other thing that exists in the private sector is there's a lot of innovation that's happening. WSP is actually that we have an innovation partners that are looking at better and more effective data. Some of the, you know, for all of history, most of the flood modeling has been done in the government sector. Now you have private firms that are kind of coming in there and making that data available. There's firms that are coming out with better stormwater management techniques, better data management techniques, funding and financing sources. So there's a lot of private sector interest in this topic. There's you know, green bonds that are being made for things. So there's really a lot of focus from the private sector that you should be aware of and really provide an opportunity for future coordination. So that's it. So I think we'll open it up to the next question.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, so now it is your turn. We're waiting on the responses to come in, and then the panelists will try to answer your questions. I'm not sure there is a great answer to that, to be quite frank. So, you know, the first responders do what they can, and they work very hard to get into the communities. You know, their first priority, frankly, is recovering bodies. And then they have to make sure it's safe to get everything else in. So, and when roads are blocked, it's a disaster. That's why they call it that. So I'm not sure there is a good or easy answer other than you're right. We can do a better job. We have to find a way to do a better job. We have to be able to find ways of staging things maybe before the storm hits so that we can get it in faster and recover faster. DEM is trying to work on that. They're also working on deploying, you know, communication satellites and things like that so they can get up and running and getting communication out as soon as possible. I see a question on the screen here. I feel like our entire town has PTSD after a major hurricane. Are there any resources to help? The answer to that is yes. DEM actually works with volunteers from across the state to send in counselors and psychologists after these major events. So I was actually talking with one of them or two of them about 3 weeks ago and trying to make sure that they are getting the word out that that is available. And I think that's part of the problem is as communities, especially when you have a storm as large as Ian was, there's only so many resources to go around. So it becomes very difficult to get people everything they need very quickly. I remember when I worked at the Water Management District, and I see a couple of my cohorts back there in the back of the room, after one of the hurricanes came through, we actually managed the distribution centers over in Arcadia. And up until that point, you know, I want to say it was 4 days later, and DEM finally put out a call, hey, we need some people with some on-the-ground organizational skills because we've got these poor folks over in Arcadia running, you know, all over the place. That the guy that was running the distribution center basically was a preacher from one of the local churches. They had traffic trying to get in and out of a shopping center. They had not a leaf on a tree. So it was very difficult, and thank goodness that gentleman did what he could do. But it took us a while from a state perspective to get in there and actually start making a difference, which is why it is so important for local communities to be prepared ahead of the storm, or whatever the event may be, whether it is, crazy heat, or it is an attack, whether it is whatever the emergency is. You've got to be prepared ahead of of time.
I think I'm going to add to that, just from the experience of the CHNEP staff down here. The scale of the Hurricane Ian impact was like nothing we've ever experienced. The amount of communities that were impacted, the level of devastation. There was, loss of life. There was water supply systems that were all corrupted. Wastewater failures were widespread for days on end. So I do think that it's important. There's what we can prepare for, and there's also, this was beyond anything that anyone had even conceived to prepare for prior to Ian, and that is why we had the session earlier today to talk about, kind of digesting what we've learned, which we still are doing even over a year later. But I can say firsthand that, we worked with the local governments that were impacted, and we ourselves, we were trying to go out to assist in doing water quality sampling. And that's what a natural resource element is, for someone who asked earlier, is that basically in emergency response, everything goes to human health and safety, but we had issues with not finding water quality sampling equipment, boats, access, boat ramps, were clogged up with derelict boats. There was no humans, because they were all being diverted to higher priority needs, trying to staff shelters, trying to help people who were displaced. So long story short is, we did learn that we need to reserve a little bit of capacity to go ahead and do water quality sampling and things like that, because that did affect first responders who got cuts, who got infections, because they were wading into contaminating water. But I will just say, working with those local governments, so many were offline at one time that it wasn't even like some neighboring communities who would normally help one another were not able to do so. We were reaching outside of our area, trying to truck in supplies and people to help. So, it really is a testament to this community, the ability that we have had to recover as well as we had, and God forbid we ever go through that again. But I think that, we've learned a lot, and hopefully next time we'll be as prepared as we can be. All right, let's go through as many of these questions as time allows. So I'm going to go through pretty quickly. So starting with Catherine, there are a few here. So one is, have you had experience including heritage, both cultural and natural, into disaster risk management plans and/or emergency preparedness? Is that something you've seen integrated in that way?
I have not worked on a project. I know maybe Sarah. I have not worked on a project which integrates heritage sites, not yet. Hopefully soon. There's a question I wanted to take on, what methods do we use to engage? There was a question on if we use paper or survey. The answer is all of the above, and really it depends on who we're trying to reach. There are communities that will not come to us when we go out there to hold public meetings. We go to them, so we do pop-ups, which will definitely have printouts. There's always going to be a digital option, because we do want to capture the younger demographics as well. So print as well as a digital. And then, like I said, all means and resources. So we work with local governments. We want to put out press releases. We want to use the community engagement that is already occurring, perhaps with other projects. So we expand that reach. So it's really using every bit of resources we have to get to the community.
I want to touch for a minute on the plans. There was a question also on best practices for the communities. Best practices would be a minimum standards or minimum practices for all communities to be able to follow, so there'd be some consistency and continuity, and it's not a bad idea. We work and prepare plans all the time, emergency preparedness, SOPs, or best practices. I want to step on the emergency operation plans for a minute in the preparation of those. The fact being that everybody wants to kind of attack the plan and have everything in it. You want to have everything in it, but remember, whoever's working and creating the plan with you, it's not their plan, it's your plan. And the key is to be able to live up to the items in the plan and be able to effectuate those things. Know what you can do and what you can't do. The worst is to have a plan and not be able to effectuate the items in that plan. So make sure when you're doing it, whoever you're working with, it's great to put everything in there from A to Z, but if they're not things you can do, know what you can't do, and then go out and seek help with regard to those items in the creation of your plans.
All right. Michael, you mentioned managed retreat is controversial. Today we saw map after map about how communities will be unlivable. So why is planning or even discussing a total loss controversial?
Is that a serious question? I mean, obviously, this is a big question. It's actually interesting. Catherine and I are working on a managed retreat research project starting in a couple of months for one of the National Academy projects. But I think that I don't think it should be controversial. But I don't know of a community that's engaged to a level of detail to say that we're going to be adjusting our design or we're going to be adjusting our investments to retreat from the shoreline. We've had a few experiences. We were doing some work in Hawaii about 2 years ago, and the Department of Transportation lead was saying, you know, if you've been to Hawaii, it's a mountain with a road that goes around it, right, to all these communities. And he was saying, we're going to commit to maintaining that access up to a point at which we're no longer going to provide that to you. You're going to have to find alternate means of communication because it's be too difficult and too costly for us to provide that level of detail. And in other areas, the question starts to be when. You know, there's obviously there's a lot of areas at the shoreline that are at risk, and they can be hardened and hardened and hardened and hardened, but eventually you're going to have to move away from the shoreline potentially to address this effectively. And so then the question starts to be when. And the only other part that I'll say about managed retreat or retreat as a controversial subject is, I was noticing this kind of coming up earlier, it's not really a managed retreat, it's mostly like an emergency response thing, is what's happening, it's almost like you know, when a storm comes through, the rebuild can only be afforded by a certain sector of the population, and a lot of people are actually having to move out of communities because they can't stay there. And then in highly desirable neighborhoods, you know, that's seen as a real estate opportunity, so it actually drives up the cost, and that's actually what you're seeing in Maui. So it's really kind of a very dynamic question, and I do agree that it should be taken on. It should be taken on at multiple levels, but I haven't really seen it taken on where the point they said that this is our set of decisions. This is the point at which we're going to stop investing in a community, and this is where we're going to start to move away. They do that now with the buyout program, which you guys probably all know. The land buyout program is kind of a managed retreat effort. In some way, that's what they're doing up in the New York region, is reducing the risks at the shoreline by buying out properties. But I've never seen kind of a organized policy around that question, because it's obviously a land ownership, land valuation question that tends to be very controversial. But Catherine and I'd love to take it on.
Yeah, I think you hit the real nail on the head there, which is the logistics. You know, no one's going to walk away and be like, oh, this house that I've built equity in, I'm just going to walk away from all that and not sell it. And, you know, so I think the buyout program and other things have to be in place to encourage people to have options to retreat if they're ready to do so. Are you aware of programs or strategies in Florida that are filling that gap and helping to provide options to those types of, you know, coastal or waterfront landowners?
I have not. I do want to provide, this is a program that's been going on for years and years, actually, in coastal North Carolina, which you may or may not be familiar with. they have a rule there, if your house gets impacted, you cannot rebuild unless you have enough space to go, it's like 50 feet plus 30 times the erosion rate. So it's actually causing retreats, houses are being, have to be vacated. If they're damaged, they can't be rebuilt. So that's actually kind of an existing managed retreat policy. But I haven't seen anything about the support for the homeowners, which is obviously, a very significant financial question. And I think that's going to be one of the larger questions over time. That's what the buyout program can do. It can give you a little bit of financial resources before the impact occurs and you lose all the value of your property. That's probably the closest thing that I've heard to an effective program.
All right, it says many resilience responses are time dependent. If it takes too long, it does no good. So many people gave up waiting. I'm not sure what that's trying to get at exactly, but if you guys have any comment on that?
Well, I was joking, we were kind of half joking earlier, sitting out there actually about how long it takes to actually get an investment in the field, like actual constructed because of all the environmental rules. You're dealing with shoreline concerns, you have all these things. So maybe that's what it is. People are saying we need a resilient solution today, and really the answer to that is you're going to get a resilient solution 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, depending on the complexity of the capital investment that you're making. And but I think for me, there are many communities that are very, very actively engaged in addressing concerns moving ahead. New York has a very, very viable program of capital investment. Coastal New Jersey, those places that saw such devastating impacts in Hurricane Sandy are taking action every day. And I think part I think of why there has been more limited investment in resilience is because people took the wrong path that I talked about earlier, and you can't make an effective case for investment unless you're talking about cause, effect, and consequences and why we should invest. And I think that's where the community is coming around to, and I think that combined with state funding, federal funding, and even some localities in Florida are starting to look at bond programs to improve resilience. You're going to start to see action coming in place, but I'm sure it's a very frustrating. People are probably walking in here today saying, "Oh, resilience tomorrow. We're going to get funding to enhance our resilience," and that's just not the way these things work necessarily. But I think you have to have patience, and you have to have but still keep pushing forward to get your resilience things in place.
All right, this question may be for you, John. What role do insurance companies play in the resilience model?
We sure do pay them a lot of money. And I'd say it jokingly, obviously, but insurance companies should play a better role with regard to their risk management on the front end and with regard to the structures that they're writing and with regard to their underwriting processes in order to, in the end, have entities that they were going to pay for and not put people in a position where sometimes policies are written and not going to be paid on. I was an insurance defense lawyer for 30 years before I got into the risk end. So I follow all of this. I understand it. And the sad part is it's a lot of time for a lot of folks, and you've got to bring public adjusters into the game, and it's a continuation, and it affects our folks in the community and their pockets and their time in order to get to where they have to be. So maybe that's not the answer you wanted, but it's a tough answer right now.
I'm going to add on to that. There are some places in the country, primarily coastal Louisiana, where insurance companies won't write policies anymore. So, exactly. So in part, it's, as John was getting at, it's a risk-based business. And if they won't write the policies or they won't fund, they won't make it affordable, Eventually, the market will probably be such that it'll somewhat take care of itself. It's kind of a self-defeating kind of thing, because insurance companies are in business to make money, let's be honest. And if they can't, then they won't write the policies.
And we have some questions for Catherine. It says, Catherine, are there funds or projects that can help communities protect places of cultural significance from sea level rise, coastal erosion, or other hazards?
As Mike had mentioned earlier, there's this unprecedented level of funding for resilience, both to assess vulnerability as well as to invest in resilience. So happy to connect whoever asked that question with our team, which really just focuses on how do we leverage both private equity monies and combine that with federal funding or state funding for these solutions. So happy to connect with whoever had that question.
And then another one in follow-up, it says, in your experience, has regaining a sense of normalcy been prioritized and included in the work you've had with communities?
I think the question really comes to how do we bounce back from a disaster? Has it been prioritized? I think there is no yes or no answer in this, but the way we've been programming or we've been approaching these vulnerability assessment is really prioritizing that along with the first part, which is how do you withstand these stressors as far as the assets themselves go. So, we talked about collaboration. There was a comment, what is the most important thing to build resilience in our community? The collaboration, the connection between the vulnerability assessment that we do, how we prioritize our assets, through the risk-based assessment, and then connecting that with the disaster planning, pre-disaster and post-disaster planning. I think that's how we get to really investing in how do we bounce back better.
I have a question for you all. I know after visiting Puerto Rico, they've basically shifted that, they have accepted that they can't really evacuate in these large storms that now overrun the entire island. So they have built these resiliency hubs for people to basically have safe places within their community to shelter in place, where they would have basic amenities. Florida has some evacuation shelters, but not so much gone the way of these resiliency hubs, having them outfitted with solar and batteries, and it's for energy sources, food, water, stockpiled essentially to allow the community to be able to be housed for days. As we know, some of these storms are moving very slowly now, so a hurricane doesn't pass in a couple hours like we might have been used to in years past. So just wondered if you see strategies like that taking hold in Florida or in other places that you work.
I'm going to call out someone in the audience. I see Sarah Kane. The concept of resiliency hubs, we are working on that right now with Sarasota County and Manatee County collaborating with the statewide as part of the EPA's Climate Pollution Reduction Grant. Really, how can we look at existing community facilities to serve as these hubs? So they're, along with Sarah and the region around, are looking at tiers, right? You have your spaces that serve as evacuation housing. So you have a tier 1, and then it's a tier 2 perhaps, which is more libraries and community centers which are within communities and smaller spaces that can serve the pre-disaster as well as the post-disaster needs, where you can distribute those sandbags before the event comes. And then there is can we get some cooling and some air conditioning after the event when there's no electricity? Can we charge our phones? So there definitely is activity and as well as interest in making some of these community spaces more resilient, and and resources for education throughout the year, cooling spaces during the hottest days where communities might not necessarily have air conditioning and such.
Yeah. I agree. It's a great idea, and I was hurriedly looking it up. There's a number of resources available to it. There's actually an active program open right now, and I know this, we're helping to deliver the West region, but there's a central and eastern region. It's called the EPA Equitable Resilience Program, and they're basically standing up studies to help pay for on the back end. It's a multi-billion-dollar implementation program, and it's a non-traditional funding source, so it's something I think everybody should kind of look into. So that's a great program, and then FEMA actually has a number of technical assistance programs. Like the challenge of dealing with FEMA is you have to deal with FEMA, and how challenging that will be. And they're actually resourcing consulting firms to go in and help communities basically do the whole thing. You know, do the assessment, do the things, stand up the resilience hub, find funding to pay for those things. So there's things like that are definitely coming on. But you know, like the idea of a resilience hub just makes so much common sense that you'd think they would have thought of it 30 years ago. But it's definitely a elevated concern, and there's funding becoming available, and it just seems like it's a great way for communities to exist in that period immediately after an event. But I was thinking about that as you were talking, like you said, is in certain events they could be very helpful, but what you guys experienced down here was really extraordinary, and I don't know what type of preparation you can do to get ready for something like that, you know.
Well, we certainly could do better. I
Yeah.
think everyone in this
Well,
room agrees that we could be doing better. There's a lot of people who tried to weather it in trailers,
Yeah.
or didn't have evacuation transportation to be able to evacuate areas that were very vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something I'm curious if you all, in your work with, I know each of you works with government, and have you seen forward momentum in people thinking about disadvantaged populations, and what additional resources need to be put in place to assist those individuals being able to safely evacuate, and to be able to know that it would not be safe to stay in structures like trailers that are not built to withstand those forces?
Right. Well, at least from my perspective, it's a very important and complex question about, particularly as it relates to equity concerns and communication, and better and a more effective communication during an event and post-event. And you know, a lot of those things are questions of timing. You know, like storms moving in one direction, and then all of a sudden it shifts in another direction, and you know, that's a lot of what you hear. But I will say, like, one of the other things that I was thinking that, you know, for those of you that are kind of struggling with working through this, you know, I think there's a lot of communities that can benefit from what you went through, to say, here's what we went through, here's all the struggles we had, here's the things that you should be. John had mentioned earlier about an after-action report, like that idea of almost like a peer exchange, or the lessons that this region learned, because, you know, most of the communities, like Florida is an index finger that points down into the origin of every hurricane that's ever been generated in human history, right? That it just basically points at them, and it's a place where a lot of great lessons could be learned, but a lot of communities are not really considering that they could happen in their communities. You know what I mean? They're not saying, well, this certainly could, and that we deal with that a lot. We have a lot of communities that aren't, you know, when you say, well, what happens if a major event comes in here, they're like, well, we don't even want to focus on that. And that's where I think the power potentially of what you just went through could benefit a lot of other folks, because you weren't expecting it here, and you hadn't seen one here in a long time, and it came aboard, and there's a lot of great information that could be generated from that, potentially to change state response policies, federal response policies, but also lessons learned for other communities on communication and evacuation and those things. So, you know, I would recommend maybe trying to get some funding and hold a after-action idea, and bring in some people from other communities so they can hear what you went through. I really do think that would be a great outcome. You know, from the entire Southeast United States could probably benefit from what happened here.
Then let's take a few last questions. Let's see. How do we better help elderly, vulnerable populations? I think we just were talking about that a little bit, who do not have access to technology during storms. What about for recovery? So much is online. So I know you all have worked with FEMA and other agencies. Are they getting better in finding other ways to reach populations who may not be as tech savvy or have access to those types of resources?
I know they're trying. That's what I said. There's these new policies that are kind of rolling out to help accommodate that. And I do know that there's you know, the challenge, the communication challenge, or the evacuation challenge, or the forced evacuation challenge, which is, I think, is what you're trying to get to, is definitely an interesting one. But that's what I think is like, you know, the best way, I think, to facilitate that is to say, hey, that was a significant concern in our region. You at the state, you need to pay better attention. You at the federal government, you need to pay better attention to this question and come up with different solutions, because what happened here didn't necessarily work the way that you would want to, and then it actually increased the risks and increased the impact because people were in place when this event occurred.
Do any of you have one final thought you'd like to share with the audience and wrap up?
Communication, cooperation, build on it, keep building on it. It's building from the base, and that base changes every day.
Along those same lines, constant vigilance, because as John was saying, it changes all the game we're playing changes all the time. We are doing the best we can. All the scientists are doing the best they can with predictive models, but there's always going to be an outlier. So the question then becomes, what do you do for the majority of the times when you know something is going to be really bad? So you have to prepare for that, and you have to do it in advance.
Think of the consequences of any decision making. Right? How does our decision impact the frontline communities? Keeping that with every investment decision making.
I'm going to let everybody else's favorite speaker and my favorite speaker have the last word. So, Kathy.
Well, join me with a round of applause to thank our panelists here. Thank you so much for sharing all of those insights with us.